So yes, welcome to this month's session of Bench Tips. This month we are joined by the wonderful Laura Jayne. Welcome, Laura Jayne.
Hi.
And this month's all about getting started with silver jewelry making. So if you are new to working with silver jewelry, then we really hope this one's going to be helpful for you guys, because we all remember what it was like when we're first starting out in our journey, and there's just so much to learn. I always say with jewelry making, it's like learning a new language at first. There's all these tools to learn about, there's all these metals to learn about, there's all these techniques. And I mean, one of the amazing things about it is it's endless. So you never get bored. There's always more to be inspired by. But it can feel like a lot at the beginning. So we wanted to do a session particularly aimed at kind of people early on in the journey. But also it's a great refresh for anyone who's kind of further along, because there's always different perspectives and more ways to learn about working with silver. Yeah, so feel free to have cameras on, cameras off, however you're comfortable. We love to see you, but obviously if you're busy doing things, then that's fine as well. Do come and say hi in the chat when you join us, though, even if your camera's not on for today. Just let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you've made any jewelry before, you could share a little bit about that. I'd love to come and see. Just going to say hello to a few more people while we let people come in, and then we will get started. So welcome, Kate, and Megan. Lovely to see you. Lisa D is here, and Linda. Yeah, and there's lots of people as well with cameras off, but hello to all of you. Petra is from Rhodes in Greece. Hello. Oh, amazing. I had a holiday in Rhodes earlier this year and it was gorgeous. Absolutely loved it, especially the food and the sea and the weather, all the things. So lovely to have you. Lisa is joining us from Buffalo, New York, USA. Welcome, welcome. Ruth, greetings from USA. Wonderful. Welcome, Ruth. Who else do we have? Andrea is here from the Northwest. She's just starting out, made a few pieces, but absorbing and learning by watching lots. Yes, absolutely. I feel like there's so much to learn. I was going to say at the beginning, but there's always so much to learn. But I think especially when you're learning any new skill or hobby or craft, it's just really a really exciting time. I remember going to my first jewelry class and just I was so excited before I went, and then but I had no idea how we were going to make things. I just hadn't even, I mean, there wasn't YouTube back in those days, so you couldn't Google it. I was just like, I have no idea how this is going to work. And I came out kind of really inspired. Angela's here from Southampton. Welcome, Angela. Yeah, brilliant. We'll keep coming and saying hi. Feel free to chat to each other in the chat. And if anybody wants to share like an Instagram or a Facebook page to connect with each other, feel free to do that. Go follow each other, because it's a great opportunity to network as well. But we will get in to today's bench tips. So Laura Jayne, thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, do you just want to share a little bit about yourself for anyone who doesn't know you, putting you on the spot, but just a little bit of background for your jewelry making?
Yeah, sure. First of all, apologies if my video is a bit frozen. Everyone's kind of frozen or moving at an odd pace for me, so I do apologize. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Yeah, I mean, I started out probably about 10 or 12 years ago, I would say. And like a lot of people, I started out with beading, making beaded jewelry. So that really is a gateway. I moved into doing some metal stamping because people were asking for sort of personalization. And from there, I really wanted to make the leap to being able to solder. And that was my main thing, was to learn how to solder so I could make full rings instead of just like wrapped rings. So I went on a solder course at my local college, which was great. And I kind of just went from there. So I've done a lot of short courses and a lot of self-taught bits and pieces. And now I'm one of the mentors for the Silver Jewellery Diploma with Jewellers Academy. You'll see me popping up in the Facebook groups for Jewellers Academy as well. And I have got my own business, which is called Small Dog Silver, because I have a small dog, and anyone who has small dogs knows that they own everything. So that's where that business came from.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. As a recent owner of a small dog, I agree with that. They own everything and they run everything.
Totally. You will never own a blanket again, Jess. They will never be your blankets ever again.
No, I totally agree with you. And Laura Jayne is also the tutor on our brand new Foundation in Silver Jewelry course, which is a 5-week program that we're running live a couple of times a year for beginners to kind of get started with silver jewelry making. So we'll share the link to that. Anna is here. Anna Campbell's our community manager, so she will be helping. So I'm sure Anna can share the link to that, or she already has in the chat. So if you're interested, do take a look. So the floor is open. If you guys have any questions for Laura Jayne, anything to do with silver jewelry making, jewelry making, we're here to kind of help and answer any questions. I know sometimes when you're just starting out, it's hard to have questions because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. So I have a few prepared that I'm going to ask in the meantime, but please do ask away. There's no such thing as a silly question. That's one of the rules at Jewellers Academy is, no matter what level you're at, beginner or professional, advanced goldsmith, master stone setter, there's no such thing as a silly question because that's how we learn. And I think sometimes it can feel like, oh, I don't even know how to phrase that question properly. But if there's anything that you would like to learn about in regards to tools, materials, silver jewelry making, soldering, like Laura Jayne spoke about, soldering, all those kind of basics, feel free to ask and we will do our best to answer. And Laura Jayne is an amazing teacher, so definitely take advantage of the fact that she is here with us tonight. So while we're waiting for some questions to come through, I thought a good place to start would maybe be to talk a bit about the materials, because we've done quite a few bits recently about the tools. We've done a podcast on the tools. Do check that one out if you haven't already, and we can talk more about tools as well. But Laura Jayne, when you first come to making silver jewelry, what are some of the materials that we may come across, and what typically would they be used for?
Yeah, so I think your main types of silver are likely to be sheet silver that you're going to see, and that is exactly as it sounds. It's the solid sheets of silver, which you can get in different thicknesses. Over in the US, you'll call that different gauges. In the UK and Europe, we tend to work in millimeters rather than gauges. Wire as well. So if any of you do any wire wrapping, you'll be really familiar with the different wires you can use. But with silver wire, you can get lots of different wire profiles. So that's the shape that it is when you kind of cut it downwards. So you can get round, which is your standard wire. You can get half round, which looks like a little D shape. You can get triangular wire, square wire. There's loads and loads of different types. And really using sheet and wire, you can pretty much make anything you want to, really. You've got some slightly more specialist materials as well. So you've got things like bezel strip or bezel wire, you might have heard it called. And that's very, very thin, and it's made from fine silver rather than sterling silver. So it's a lot softer, easier to move around. And then you've got your solders. They come in a few different formats as well. So you've got your kind of wire solder, which looks a little bit like a ribbon, a thick ribbon, which you cut up into little pieces to use. You've got paste solder as well, which comes in like a little tube, and that can be used as well. So the solder that we use for silver jewelry making is very different to the solder that you'd use for something like working with a soldering iron, for instance. It's different alloys, and it's suitable for skin contact. So that's quite an important one to note if you're just starting out. So it's always worth buying your materials from a good bullion dealer or a good jewellery supply place. You can pick stuff up on Amazon and eBay, but you're never entirely sure what you're going to get.
It's a bit of a free for all, isn't it? And especially
Little bit.
especially silver, which is something you're gonna potentially hallmark. You want to make sure, as Laura Jayne said, to find a good source. Cooks and Gold in the UK is one of the biggest, and in America we've got places like Rio Grande. I don't know if there's any other places you buy bullion from, Laura Jayne.
In the UK, yeah, Cooks and Gold typically is my go-to, mainly because they are quite quick and they tend to have everything in stock. Betts Metals is another good one as well. There's a company called Argex. They're pretty good, but they're not. Their website isn't as easy to kind of navigate. Over in the US, yeah, you've got Rio Grande, and I've heard some really great things about a company called Monster Slayer over in the US as well. So it's worth checking those guys out.
Absolutely. Wonderful. We have a couple of questions through, which is brilliant. So Josephine says, hello, I would like to ask about pickle. Does it have to be hot? How long should you leave the items in, and how often should you replace it? And maybe just to add to that, what is pickle for anyone listening thinking, what is that? A great question.
So, it is a really good question. So pickle is not the stuff you put on your sandwiches, sadly. It is a relatively weak acidic solution, and as jewelers we use it after soldering to kind of clean up our metal pieces. When you solder, you're obviously heating your metal, and whether you're using copper or brass or silver or gold, but sort of normally the lower metals, so copper, brass, silver, the copper content within each of those typically will start to oxidize. So it's a little bit like if you leave a piece of silver jewelry on the side and it tarnishes. When you're soldering, because you're heating your metal, it pretty much speeds up that tarnishing process because of the oxidization of the copper. So you get like a grubby outer, on the metal. Also, because we use something called Flux, which helps the solder to flow, that can form almost like a glassy coating on your metal as well. So once you've soldered something and it's cooled down, you'd pop it in pickle, which is this acidic solution. You don't have to use the pickle hot, but it is quicker if you use it hot. So how long do you need to leave something in there? I mean, in honesty, I don't think anybody who's a jeweler could probably realistically say they haven't put something into pickle and forgotten about it overnight. I know I haven't. And that, I mean, that's fine. If you leave something in overnight by accident, it's probably not going to do it that much damage. If you've got a very, very strong acid solution, obviously it will start to kind of slightly eat away at the metal. So you need to keep an eye on that. But typically, if you've just got something that you've soldered quite quickly and you just need to clean it up, I would say in cold pickle, probably anywhere between half an hour and an hour. In warm pickle or hot pickle, you're probably looking at more like about 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. Different types of pickle out there. So typically we'll use something called safety pickle, or pickline, which I think is the brand name of it. A lot of it is citric acid, and it's got some other surfactants in there as well. You can use just a solution of citric acid and water. You can go really kind of more, well, there's not really much more natural than citric acid powder and water, but you can just use vinegar, white vinegar and salt, which will also work, but then you will want fish and chips. So, it balances out. The most important thing about it, though, is it's not the actual pickle that's toxic when you come to dispose of it. It's the fact that it's contaminated with copper. So it's the copper content in the pickle that then becomes toxic to marine life, and really you definitely do not want to be just disposing of that pickle down the drain or down the toilet or anything like that. My suggestion is, if you need to change your pickle or dispose of it, you put it into clump forming cat litter and it will just soak it all up. Put it into a container or a bag, and then contact your local council or your local household refuse site and ask them what you should be doing with stuff that is contaminated with copper. And they should be able to advise you on that, but definitely don't be putting it down the loo. When it comes to how often you need to change your pickle, to be honest, as long as you haven't put anything that is ferrous, e.g. nothing sort of steel or iron has dropped into it, you probably don't need to change it. You can just keep topping it up. I think I've had my current batch of pickle in my pickle warmer for, I would say, at least 2 years, and I just add a little bit of extra pickle powder and a little bit of extra water when it starts to evaporate. But yeah, you don't really need to change it unless it's contaminated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I saw someone in one of the Jewelers Academy groups saying they've had their pickle for 10 years and they've never changed it. So if you look after
Absolutely.
it, and sometimes it kind of crystallizes, doesn't it, and dries out, but you can just add some more water, because all it really is these salts that you mix with water and kind of mix it in. So it's quite I think it can sound quite daunting before you do it, but once you do it, you're like, oh, okay, I'm kind of on top of that. And I know here in my studio, I kind of have like a crock pot, kind of like what are they called, like rice warmers or something that so in terms of heating it, there's different methods for heating it, but just kind of put it on a low setting. And when I'm in the studio, although I have to remember to turn it off, I have to remember to turn it off, otherwise it all dries out. And I know some people use just like a mug warmer, so it can be quite straightforward to keep it warm as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't need to go and spend a lot of money on the kind of branded jewelry pickle warmers. They are really, really expensive, and they do exactly the same job as something like a small slow cooker, a small crock pot. I actually use a baby bottle warmer, so one of the Tommy Tippy baby bottle warmers with a plastic soup pot in it. And it's fine, and that's absolutely perfect for me because it's quite a small footprint on your solder station then as well.
Absolutely. So hopefully that's covered pickle, but if there's any more follow-up questions, feel free to ask them. There's a question from Petra who says she'd like to ask a specific question. When she orders chains that are copper or brass and they're coated in a rose gold color, it's a lower price point, so it's not real rose gold. What is the alloy they use to color the chains? I wasn't sure if this is just plated in rose gold, perhaps.
It could be just a flash plating. So there are different thicknesses of metal plating. But typically if you're buying, copper chain that's or base metal, so copper is a base metal. So if you're buying rose gold look or rose gold tone chains, it can be any kind of plating. It doesn't necessarily have any gold in the plating solution. In the UK especially, and Europe, you need to be really careful about what you are buying if you are intending to sell it, because we've got quite stringent regulations around the metals that can actually be used for skin contact, so for necklaces, rings, earrings, etc. So we've got some quite good safety measures around things like nickel and nickel release, so you do have to be a bit careful about what you're buying. The best thing to do, to be honest, is to ask the place that you're thinking of buying them from and actually ask them what it is. They should be able to tell you. Yeah, I mean, if it's a really, really fine coat, it could be rose gold plated, but typically they will actually tell you that it is, you know, gold plated rather than gold coloured or gold toned. So it's worth having a good read through the description of things before you buy. And if you're in doubt, just ask the suppliers. If they can't or won't tell you, I'd probably not buy from them.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Laura Jayne. That's helpful. It's such a minefield out there, isn't it, at first when you're buying like chains,
Really,
wires, all these things from different suppliers. And I think especially the base metal stuff, because obviously with the silver and gold and all of that, there's a lot more regulations and you know where to go. But when you're sort of working on other things, you still want to work with them because they can look really gorgeous. And, you know,
yeah,
it's sometimes you get more
definitely.
variety. But yeah, having that knowledge, and don't be afraid to ask, like Laura Jayne said. And if people are unkind to you, because sometimes, you know, as beginners, I remember sometimes I'd go into a shop and sort of say, oh, what's this? And they'd sort of look at me funny. Then, you know, then we don't really want to work with them anyway. So it kind of helps you work out what suppliers you enjoy, you know, working with as well. And, you know, I did mention the Jewelers Academy Facebook groups. If you're not already in it, I definitely recommend going in there as well after the session, because it's such a good place to ask, like, you know, has anyone else used this supplier, or, you know, some of these questions obviously on a more day-to-day basis, because there's so many lovely people in there, jewelers, who are kind of happy to help as well, if it's anything, you know, like a specific link you want us to have a look at with you, or something like that. Brilliant. Thanks for the question, Petra. Gloria has asked, is it best to learn to solder with wire? I've tried paste and it looks much easier. So perhaps we can talk a little bit around like what's best for starting to learn to solder, and also the paste versus pallion type situation.
Yeah. So both of them, or all the different types of jewellery solder, have absolutely got their place, and they are definitely all really good for certain purposes. I am incredibly envious of people that I watch who do wire soldering, who literally, you know, use the solder as a piece of wire and hold it to the pieces they're putting the flame on, just to use a tiny bit of solder off the end of a whole piece of wire. I can't quite get my head around that, and I've never managed to do that successfully, so I've stopped. Paste solder is really, really handy for things like jump rings and for doing kind of small scale granulation. I wouldn't necessarily personally use it for bigger pieces. The reason being that paste solder, you have to be you have to be really, really regimented with how much you use of it. So because it's a paste, I think you're kind of lulled into that sense of maybe using it almost like a glue, which you definitely don't want to do. Because once the binders and the flux that's actually built into that paste solder burns off, what will happen is the solder itself will just run everywhere. And anyone who's ever had to try and clean up a lot of excess solder knows that it is no fun whatsoever. So just in general, for any type of solder, always use less than you think you're going to need, because you can always add a bit more, but it's really difficult to clean it up if it goes everywhere. I tend to use strip solder or ribbon solder, so it does look like a thin ribbon. I make it even thinner. I've got a rolling mill, so I use a rolling mill to thin it down, but you can just pop it onto a bench block and hammer it, and it will flatten it out, and it makes it thinner, which makes it easier for you to cut even smaller pieces, and they're what Jess referred to as pallions. And then you can use that solder. Paste solder does come in all of the different grades that wire and strip solder come in, so you can use them. It's definitely worth experimenting and seeing what works for you. I personally prefer strip solder, although sometimes I do use a bit of paste solder if I'm doing like small granulation work, but mostly I'll use strip solder for pretty much everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just something I'd say on solder as well is I think it can be the most intimidating aspect of learning to make silver jewelry. And I don't know if you had this, Laura Jayne, as well, but I just resisted learning to solder properly for years. I tried every workaround. I was like, I'll just make things that don't join. Because I think I tried it a few times and it didn't work and I got frustrated. And actually, we used to do a class at the London Jewelry School, and it's now part of the silver diploma called the Soldering Masterclass. And as I took that, it was like 3 years into my jewelry making. And I was like, why didn't I do this earlier? Because it's one of those things, if you kind of just push yourself, and it does sometimes require a bit of pushing because it's not immediate, to do the kind of drills of learning to solder, it does just click. And you reach this point where you're like, I can solder now. And the freedom that comes from that, and everyone here, like each and every one of you can learn that. It can feel at the beginning like, oh gosh, there's a lot. There's flames and flux and it just keeps flying off. But I think, spending a day or a week or a month or however long you need to just sit down and just solder, like don't make a nice piece of jewelry, just practice the soldering until you kind of feel confident. It's really worth the frustration and the investment of time, because once you've got that under your belt, we talk about in the silver diploma, there's 3 fundamental skills that once you learn as a jeweler, you're kind of set, and that's soaring, filing, and soldering. And I think soldering is the one that just brings that real freedom. And yeah, with the paste, I think sometimes it's tempting to work with paste more because you think it'll be easier. But most jewelers do prefer to learn working with the strip solder and then using paste for like specialist things, like Laura Jayne said, because I think the other thing with paste, it can go off and you need it's not the most practical sometimes to have like all 3 versions of the paste and to keep them all fresh and all of that. Whereas the strip kind of it's more traditional, I suppose, and we don't necessarily always prefer what's more traditional, but I think learning the hard way early on makes your life much easier with everything you kind of do going forwards.
Definitely. I mean, I know people that have kind of picked up jewelry making like years and years, literally kind of decades actually after they put it down previously, and they're using the same solder. So I've seen somebody in a group recently who said that they learnt some stuff at university or at college when they were a lot younger, didn't do anything with it, and then something like 50 years later got their stuff out, and then they just used the strip solder that they got in their kit from when they were at university, and it was still absolutely fine. So it does last pretty much forever. Whereas paste solder does have a tendency to dry up, so it's a bit of a pain.
Yeah, absolutely. Anna has a good question. Maybe we can talk about the different types of silver. So like 925, fine silver, what the different things mean.
Yeah, sure. So you've probably seen 925 stamped on lots of different things. 925 is the numeric value for sterling silver, and it just means that it is 925 parts in 100 of silver. And then the remaining. Sorry, in fact, I said 100. Oh, yeah. I was thinking 92 and a half, and then it translated. I'm very bad with maths and decimal.
We knew what you meant. We knew what you meant.
Okay. 92.5% of it is pure silver. And the other percentage, which I think is 7.5, please maths don't fail me now, typically copper. And the copper just gives it a little bit more strength. So fine silver, which is another thing that you might hear, is 999 on the purity scale. And that is used for things like bezels, which is like the little rim of silver that you might see outside of a stone on silver jewelry. You can use it for other things. It's just nowhere near as strong. It kind of remains quite soft and malleable, but it does fuse together really beautifully without having to use solder, but you do have to work out, you know, what applications you can use it for. There's also argentium, which is a slightly different animal. So it's alloyed with something called germanium, and it tends to be a lot more tarnish resistant, but it's slightly different to work with than sterling or fine silver, in the way that you have to handle it when soldering and when you're kind of heating it. So that's not something that I work with. I work with 925 or 999 silver.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're very similar to work with, aren't they, Laura Jayne? There's just a few tiny,
very similar.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And we often, no one's asked this, but we often used to get people ringing up the jewelry school saying, can't I just work with gold? Can't I just start with gold? And I can understand that question because I love gold as well. But of course, it's very expensive. And working with silver, working with brass, working with copper, working with gold, it's like 90% the same. There are differences, and as you kind of develop and grow in your making, if you do move on to working with gold, you can kind of work on those differences. But something that I think is great is, you know, learn how to solder, you learn how to saw, you learn how to file, all these things. If you can do them in one metal, it's very similar to do them in the other. So if you're improving your silver jewelry making skills, you are also improving your gold jewelry making skills. There'll just be a few little tweaks once you get to that higher level to kind of work with the gold. But I think that's quite a nice thing to know, because it all is kind of part of your toolkit of being a maker. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. These questions are great, by the way. Keep them coming. Andrea says, what solder do you use if you're learning and practicing with copper? Thanks in advance.
I would still use solder, the same solder that I use for silver. So I would use hard solder or easy solder. And they're the different grades of solder. You can get hard, medium, easy, and extra easy solder. They just refer to the melting points of the solder itself. There's not a huge deal in it, if I'm honest. And I typically will do as many solder joins as possible in hard solder, just because I normally have it to hand. Yeah, so those are the different there's the different types of solder, but they are absolutely usable on copper and brass and silver. You can get copper solder. However, I've never found that it colour matches particularly well with copper anyway. And also you don't see it in the UK very often. It's more something that you tend to find in the US. So if you do look for it, you'll probably be having to, if you're in the UK, you'll probably be having to import it from the US. So you're absolutely fine using silver solder. It will still join your copper together beautifully.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And yeah, Laura Jayne was talking about like the hard, medium, and easy. And the reason why we have those different ones is as you develop your skills, if you make pieces with lots of solder joins, so let's say you've got maybe 5 or 6 solder joins in your piece, and then at the end you just want to attach a jump ring on, but you don't want to melt all the things you've done before. You might use easy solder right at the end to add the final detail, because it has a lower melting temperature, which means it won't heat up all the other pieces. Now, there's other things you can do, you know, to help stop the solder from flowing. There's various blockers and things, and perhaps it's getting a little bit advanced if you're new and it's going over your head. Don't worry. It's totally fine. You start with one solder join and just perfecting the one solder join, and we kind of go from there. But yeah, we always start with hard solder, because that's, you know, it's a little bit stronger than the others, and then we kind of have room to grow in a way. But thank you for the question. It's a really useful one, and working with copper is great, isn't it, Laura Jayne, to start with, you know, instead of starting with.
Yeah, copper's really nice to work with. When you're saw piercing it, you might find that it feels a little bit more sticky than silver. It's a weird thing to say, and if you've never done any saw piercing on anything, it will mean absolutely nothing to you. But you tend to kind of get a feel for the different metals. So yeah, but copper is beautiful to work with. It forms very, very similarly to silver. The only thing to be aware of with copper is that when you're soldering it, it will likely look like you have burnt it. Don't worry about it. Copper just oxidizes really, really fast. Pickle will get it off, so don't worry. It takes an awful lot to melt copper.
Challenge set.
I mean, copper wire you can melt. I'm talking about copper sheet. It takes a lot to like melt a hole in copper sheet,
It's
but it
pretty
is like,
hardy. Yeah.
yeah, it is likely to go really, really, really kind of crusty and messy. But don't worry about it. You haven't destroyed anything. It will all come off in the pickle.
Absolutely. Alana says, hi, I'm a complete beginner and would like to ask if I can make my spare room into my jewelry cave or whether I need ventilation for heat and soldering.
So you can absolutely make your spare room into, you know, into your jewelry room. It's lovely if you've actually got the space. It's a proper luxury having a dedicated working space, not least because it means that you don't have to tidy everything away every time you finish. You can just close the door and walk away. With regards to ventilation, it's good to have some ventilation because some of the things that we're working with, like the pickle, if you're using it hot, it can give off some fumes. Soldering a little bit, you know, it can give off some fumes from your metal. One of the things that you can do is to create a kind of a cross breeze, if possible, in your room. So if you have got a window, I would open the window slightly and then I'd have like a fan just sort of on the other side of the room, just so you've got a breeze coming across you. Don't want it like a proper gust of wind because that will make soldering tricky. It's also good to wear breathing, I was going to say apparatus, which makes it sound like you're going to come in like a fireman. But, you know, like you can get the 3M respirators, the half masks. So anything like that is really, really helpful. It's really important to protect your lungs, especially. If you're doing a lot of filing as well, it's something that's worth thinking about, wearing a mask or a lot of polishing, just because it creates a lot of dust and you don't want to be breathing that in for long periods of time. But yeah, you can absolutely create kind of a cross breeze. When you get more into it, you can do sort of relatively simple things to create fume extractors. So you can do that by using like the silver venting that you get on like tumble dryers sometimes, and you can attach that to what's called an inline fan, which is a little bit like the ventaxias that you sometimes see in bathrooms or in kitchens. And you can actually kind of buy those so you don't have to plug them into a wall, and then you can just pop that, you know, so that the mouth of the tube is somewhere near your soldering station and it'll pull all those fumes away and out of a window. So there's quite a lot of things that you can do that are non-destructive to your property, I think is the thing I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me with ventilation as well, it comes down a little bit to how much you're doing and how frequently. Like if you're in there every day and it's your full-time job, then you'll want a slightly more involved kind of ventilation process, which even as Laura Jayne said, doesn't even need to be intrusive or expensive. It just needs to be maybe thought through. Whereas if you're just there for an hour or so a week, you know, a couple of hours a week at the beginning, you probably don't need to worry. You know, cracking open a window is probably enough for most things. Yeah, but it will also depend a little bit on your, you know, your kind, like how you feel about it. You know, like a lot of these things, like safety goggles, some people wear them when they're soldering, some people don't. For me, like things like drilling or things where something could flick off, I've got my goggles on. Whereas with a torch, I don't. But that's my personal, we all have our own personal kind of attitude to safety, what we feel comfortable with, what we do. Same if you were like cooking or, you know, doing anything in the home, certain things you might you might see someone else do and think, oh gosh, I wouldn't do that. Or the other way around. But yes, good question about ventilation. And definitely I think always cracking a window open when you're working is probably a good idea at the very least. Wonderful. Thank you, Laura Jayne, and thank you for the question. Josephine asks, which solder, gold or silver, should you use when you want to add a small gold detail like granules to silver? So you've got a silver piece, you're adding like a little gold detail. What solder would you use?
I'd use silver. I'd use silver solder.
Yeah.
Yeah, typically you would use silver solder for adding like a small detail. And just be aware that you want to use not much solder, especially if you're adding gold. I've had it happen where I've done like a granulated ring, so I've added lots of like little beads of silver, and I've added some gold as well, and I just got a little bit over enthusiastic with the solder. And then when I sent it off for hallmarking and I told the assay office there was gold on there, they went, no, there isn't. I went, no, there really is. Just scrape it a little bit more. And they went, yeah, we think it might have just been a bit covered in solder. I was like, oh, the shame. But yeah. So yeah, use silver solder for adding little gold accents, but are on the side of less is definitely more.
Yeah, you only need a tiny bit, don't you? I think I've definitely been guilty of adding too much because I'm like, I really want it to work. I really don't want to have to do this again. So I'll put loads on to make up for it. But you're right, it's tricky to come off, especially with granules. But yeah, I remember a teacher saying to me once, I asked the same question, and they said, well, you can use gold or silver solder, but silver solder's cheaper and you're not going to see it. So you may as well use the cheaper one rather than using gold solder, which, there's no added benefit to that. Yeah.
Definitely.
So good question. Thank you. There is a question from Isaline, I hope I'm saying your name right, who says, anyone have experience with jewelry making while pregnant? Any advices on what to pay attention to? And Anna has posted a resource for that as well, because it is a really good question and we get asked this a lot. And I think, it's another thing where it's a little bit about your own personal attitude to things. Some people don't make while they're pregnant. Most people do continue and just have different kind of practices. But yeah, I don't know, Laura Jayne, if you have any thoughts on this.
I think it is definitely personal preference. As you said, I've known of people who just continue to make, just taking a few more precautions, maybe wearing, a mask when they wouldn't normally have done in the past. Or I've known some people who've stopped doing the soldering side of things and gotten someone else to do that, or, that kind of stuff. But I think what's probably really important is that you actually just speak to your healthcare provider about it. So speak to your midwife or your doctor, your GP. All of the things that we use, so all of the pickle that we use and the flux and all of those kind of chemically things that we're using should have what's called an MSDS sheet, and that's like a safety data sheet, and it tells you basically what's in the the chemical that you're using, what's in the compounds that you're using. A lot of them look really scary, and they're anything can be dangerous if you misuse it, right? So just common sense. You can take the MSDS sheets with you to speak to your midwife or to speak to your doctor, and they should be able to advise you on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And hopefully the blog post will help as well. But please just do whatever you feel comfortable with. I know if it were me, there's certain things like enameling that I wouldn't do because there's some issues with the powder and some of them have bits of lead in and stuff like that. So there's more specific practices, but there's always something you can do. And I think this goes for also if people are unwell. I've known jewelers who just really design really well through stages of not being able to have the same access to things, or they might kind of learn a different type of jewelry making in that time, really focus on making like chains or something that's like much more you can kind of sit and do with your hands. So there's always, don't, whatever, you know, whether it's pregnancy or illness or dexterity or whatever, there's always a workaround. There's always a way you can make jewelry and be creative that's kind of safe and fun for you. Yeah, so just have a look at the resources and see what makes you feel, you know, feel safe and comfortable with your practice. Brilliant. Petra says, oh God, saw with brass was a nightmare in the beginning. So yeah, I think for me, like sawing is just a nightmare in the beginning because I didn't realize I was going to break so many blades, and you haven't really talked about sawing, but I remember going to my first jewelry class, and the only time I'd used a saw was at school in DT with wood, and I just like I pushed, you know, like this, and I was like, that was my understanding of how to saw, is you put effort in elbow. And sawing for jewelry making couldn't be any more different, could it? Perhaps, I mean, Laura Jayne's an amazing piercer, sawer. She won't say that herself, but I've seen it in action. Maybe you could just share a little bit about sawing. There's not a specific question, but yeah, I think it can be helpful. Best practices for sawing, maybe.
Everybody breaks saw blades. It doesn't matter how long you've been doing it. Honestly, I have days where I can break almost every single saw blade that I put into my saw. Sometimes it just happens. So yeah, it feels kind of alien when you first start to use a jeweler's saw, because as Jess mentioned, you use it in a different way than you would use like a hacksaw or a wood saw. So for a hacksaw or a wood saw, you're going across your piece, you're going across your whatever it is you're cutting. And even though a jeweler's saw is very similar to something like a hacksaw, you actually use it this direction. So you've got the blade going up and down, and you're using it in this direction. So the teeth on the jeweler's saw blades are very, very fine. It cuts on the downstroke only. It's not like a double-sided sawtooth. And yeah, it can be challenging to get going. And if you are just starting out, one of the best things that I can suggest is when you put your blade into your saw, make sure you get really good tension onto the blade. You don't want the blade to be loose. So you should be able to pluck it with your finger and it sound like a really high-pitched note. So you can have a bit of a moment of pretending that you know how to play the harp, you know, pluck that saw blade, get that lovely high note. Use something like some beeswax or candle wax. I put mine down the back of the blade, not actually onto the teeth. And it just provides enough lubrication to help the saw blade go through the metal a little bit easier. There are various different types of saw lubrication that you can get, but you know, a candle will work, honestly. So yeah, and really just go for it. Don't worry about breaking blades. You're likely to break blades. You'll more likely break blades if you try and push the saw into the metal. You need to let the blade kind of do its own job. You don't need to have like a super tight grip on your saw handle. You can get away with holding it really with just thumb and one finger. You know, it's a really gentle grip. And just let the saw go through the metal. If you try and rush, or you get annoyed, or you tense up, you're probably going to break a blade. So it's a really good indication of if you're getting really, really tense. If you break loads and loads of blades in a row, probably walk away, do something else for a bit, come back, you know, have another go at it. Don't just buy the cheapest blades either. I think be kind to yourself and buy some good saw blades, because there's a big difference. And I know a lot of people will sort of shrug and go, how can there be any difference? But there really is. So some of the cheaper saw blades, you'll find that there can be manufacturing faults in them. So you can actually just get a batch of bad blades. It might not be you know. But I would go for a slightly more expensive blade. It's probably going to make your life easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't forget to breathe.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely. Don't hold your breath. That won't help. You'll give yourself a headache, and it just won't be fun. Yeah, I mean, yeah, just go for it and have fun with it. That's to be fair, that's kind of the main thing with the whole of jewelry making. Honestly, just have fun with it.
Yeah, love that. Thank you, Laura Jayne. Um, there's a few more questions. So Claire asked, any advice on looking after your tools? I'm on the silver diploma and I'm thinking specifically of the files as I'm moving from copper and brass to silver. So any tips on cleaning them?
Um, to be honest, you're absolutely fine to be using your the same tools on copper, brass, silver, and even gold. Um, you don't need to have separate tools for each separate metal. The only things that you want to keep your jewelry making, silversmithing tools away from is things like aluminium, and also if you get into it, platinum, just because the shavings from aluminium and platinum do not play nicely with silver and gold and the rest of the metals that we typically use. You can buy something that's called a file card, which sounds really strange. It actually just looks like a brush that's got wire bristles. And if you look at the face of your file, what you should be able to see is it's almost like a crisscross diagonal pattern, and that's actually the cut of the file. So they're like teeny tiny teeth. You can use this file card or this brush, and you can just kind of sweep out the filings that might be stuck um, into your file, and you just basically go along the lines that you can see on the surface of your file, and you should find that it just comes out easily. You can gently knock it against your bench peg, gently knock it against your bench, and you should find that most of the stuff comes out of there. Yeah, I typically kind of just don't do a great deal with my files, mainly because I tap them after I've been using them, and most of that dust in there will just come out by itself.
Yeah, I love files. They're so sturdy. I've had my same half round file for like a good 15 years and I use it on everything and it's just, it's got
They feel great.
character. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
You definitely get used to how they feel, and then if you kind of get a new one, it takes a little while for you to really love it as much as the old faithful ones. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm slightly ashamed to say it, but never cleaned it. I just keep going. So yeah, sometimes we worry, a lot, a lot about our tools, but sometimes they just kind of get
Yeah.
on. But yeah, if you can see kind of the copper coming off on the silver, then that's probably a sign that, I mean, I don't really use a lot of copper, so maybe that's why, but it's probably a sign you need to give it a brush. But yes, thank you for the question.
Copper can be a bit more sticky, so yeah, for copper, I would just give it a quick go over with a file card. So you can find them on most of the jewelry supply websites in the UK
Yeah,
or
and in the
in the
silver
US.
diploma, toolkit, you have a file brush included. So if you got the toolkit, you'll have one in there. Because I know because you're using wax as well with the same files. So it's yeah, the same sort of thing as a file card, I think. Um, brilliant. Thank you. I think there's just a couple final questions. Isaline says, talking about working with gold, is there a difference between working with white and yellow gold?
Not really. The only thing I would say is that the white gold you tend to see in the shops typically has got something called rhodium plating, which is what makes it really bright white. White gold in its normal form tends to be like a pale yellow. It's a very pretty colour, but it wouldn't necessarily be what you'd expect when you see it in front of you. But no, working with different colours of gold is okay. Obviously, you can get different grades of solder as well for the different types of gold. So you can get white gold solder. Again, the only thing I would say there is you may still be able to see a solder line because it might be a slightly different alloy with the solder than it is with your actual white gold metal.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Laura Jayne said, pretty much the same. The main difference I find working with golds is the different carats of gold, but that's to do with the hardness of it. So if you're setting a stone, for example, and you want to push it over, some of them, like 9 carat is a lot harder. So it's a harder job than working with a softer carat of gold, like 18 or 14. But yeah, we should do a bench tips one day on gold. That'll be a fun one. I feel like we could talk about gold for at least an hour. Brilliant. And Lisa says, can you talk about flux and also which gauge of solder wire to use for which project? Interesting. Maybe we can talk about flux first.
Yeah, sure. So flux, again, is something that we use in jewellery making and soldering, and it helps the solder to flow where we want it to. It's not to be confused with the flux that you would use, again, for electrical soldering or for using with a soldering line, because that's a different type of flux. So the traditional thing that we would use as jewellers would be something called borax flux, and it tends to come as a cone and you grind it in a dish into like a paste. There are also liquid fluxes and spray fluxes. They've all got their place, and it really does come down to personal preference, I would say, which one you choose to use. I use a spray flux, and I really like it just because it's fast and it works really well. But yeah, there are a few out there and they've all got their own place. And some people absolutely swear by just using a borax cone and don't use anything else. And that's great because you can mix it to different consistencies as well. With regard to the solder question, I don't use wire solder. So I would suggest that it doesn't necessarily matter what gauge you buy. If you're going to use it and cut it into little pieces to use as solder pallions, I would suggest that regardless of which gauge of solder wire you buy, you flatten it out, so you thin it out, and it will just make it easier to cut. If you're going to use it for stick soldering, so actually just using the wire, I'm not entirely sure which one you'd want to use. So unfortunately, that's not one that I can answer because I don't use it in that way. But for using it how I would use it, which is cutting it into small pieces, I don't think it'll matter what size you buy, what gauge you buy.
Yeah, absolutely. And if, just in case, Lisa, you meant by gauge like the hard, medium and easy, because I know there's a lot of terminology at the beginning, it can be hard to
figure out. Yeah, there is that.
Then we always start with hard, and you would move on to like medium and easy if you've got lots of solder joins. But I wouldn't worry about that too much to begin with. I think just practicing with hard, and doing some of the more basic projects first, and then because you don't want to overwhelm your brain with all the information. Too much overload at the beginning can actually prevent you from making progress. So kind of just starting with, I always say to the students, like, what's the next step? What's the next thing? Because you will learn it all, and there's always room for more, but what do I need just to do the next project? Yeah, so hopefully that helped. Okay, last question of the night. You've done so well, Laura Jayne. Thank you for sharing all of this with us. Petra says it's about bench scraps and shaves. So she says, I've got a question about bench scraps, shaves, and overall metal dust. Do you keep all of it perhaps to melt later? I only work now with brass and copper. Do you perhaps separate through projects? So maybe we can talk about what also with silver, what we would do with our scraps.
Yeah, so for me, what I do with my scrap silver, so any kind of offcuts of wire or offcuts of sheet metal, I've just got a little pot that I've just put that all into. And then I reuse mine. So I'll make little granules, or I'll actually melt it down and use it for other things. With the dust that goes into my sort of bench skin, which is what sits underneath my bench peg when I'm filing or when I'm sawing, I typically, again, I'll kind of sweep that all out of there every so often, and I'll put it into a different container. Once I've got enough of that silver dust, I will send it to be refined. I haven't quite got there yet, to be honest, just because, you know, I just don't have enough in the pot to make it worthwhile. For stuff like brass and copper and dust, I don't keep those particularly, only because melting brass, melting copper is pretty tricky, and I wouldn't really necessarily reuse it. So yeah, I mean, it's up to you. Again, you can send mixed metals off to refineries. So there are a few different companies that will either come to you and collect all of your scraps and all of your sweeps, and even you know, if you use kind of wet wipes or anything to wipe your surfaces down, keep all of those in a bag, because you can send those off to be refined. I know some jewelry studios will even send their carpets, you know, everything, and they all get burnt together and then the metal gets refined. But for things like the base metal, I don't really keep hold of those, just because I'm never likely to reuse them. Obviously, if there's big chunky pieces, I keep them, but little tiny scraps, I don't tend to use them.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Laura Jayne, and thank you everyone for being here. I hope you learned something today. I know I did. I always do. If you are interested in learning silver jewelry making, definitely check out the foundation course. It's a brilliant course, 5 weeks. You make 5 beautiful silver projects. We also have tool and material kits. So if you kind of just want everything you know that you need in order to make those pieces, it's a really lovely introduction to silver jewelry making. I know Anna's popped the link in the chat as well. And if you have any follow-up questions after today, or just, you know, in general for the rest of your life, come and join us in the Jewelers Academy Facebook group. Like I said, it's such a warm and welcoming community. It's really welcoming to beginners as well, because I know that that can feel kind of intimidating. There's lots of jewelers of all level in there, so any questions that we haven't managed to answer today, or any follow-ups, just pop them in there, and loads of jewelers will be able to help. And Laura Jayne, if people want to come and find you and connect with you, where is the best place for them to do that?
I'm on Instagram as Small Dog Silver. And I'm also on Facebook as the same, but I'm kind of in and out of the Facebook groups as well, so you can normally catch me there.
Brilliant. Yeah, definitely go and give Laura Jayne a follow and say thank you. And we do a bench tips every month. They're always on different topics, different levels. Some of them are more advanced, intermediate, beginners, or just totally random things as well. So do look out for them. If you're not already on our mailing list, we will sign up there, and we'll let you know about them as they come out. And yeah, good luck with your jewelry making, guys. Keep going, whatever you're doing. And we look forward to seeing you on another session soon. Thanks again, Laura Jayne. Thanks, Anna, for helping as well. And thank you all for being here. We'll see you soon. Bye for now.